3 weeks before the security footage surfaced, before the parking lot, before the name on that conference room door meant anything to anyone in that building. 3 weeks before all of it, Deon Wakefield was eating a gas station sandwich in his car because the break room had gone quiet the moment he walked in. He noticed these things. He always had. He'd been at Hargrove Logistics for 4 months by then, brought on as a floor supervisor at the Memphis Distribution Center on Lamar Avenue. The job wasn't glamorous. 12-hour shifts, concrete floors, the smell of diesel and shrink wrap baked into everything. But Deon was good at it, genuinely, measurably good at it. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought that would be enough. It wasn't. The building had its own hierarchy, the kind that never appears on any org chart. At the top of that invisible ladder sat a man named Bryce Calloway, Regional Operations Director, 43 years old, the kind of handshake and golf club manager who had never once operated a forklift, but could tell you, with complete confidence, exactly what the men operating them were doing wrong. Bryce had been at Hargrove for 11 years. He had a custom parking space, a corner office on the second floor, and a deep, instinctive suspicion of anyone who didn't look the way he expected a person in authority to look. Deon was 37. He was black. He had a degree in supply chain management from Tennessee State, 6 years at a competitor, and an efficiency record that, quietly, without fanfare, was already turning heads at the corporate level. But none of that was visible in the way that Bryce Calloway measured things. What was visible? Deon's beat-up Ford F-150 in the employee lot. His thrift store Carhartt jacket, practical rather than stylish. The way he spoke to the loading dock guys by name, ate lunch with them, knew whose kid had a soccer game on Saturday. These were not the signals Bryce was trained to read as competence. These were the signals Bryce filed away under a different category entirely. The first time it happened was subtle, October, maybe the second week. Deon had restructured the inbound receiving schedule. Small change, nothing dramatic, just a timing adjustment that cut dwell time by 18%. He'd submitted the proposal through the system the way you were supposed to. 3 days later, at the all-hands, Bryce stood at the front of the room and walked the team through a new initiative with his name on the slide deck. Deon sat in the back row and said nothing. He told himself it was politics. He told himself every new person goes through it. He told himself the work would speak. But then it happened again, and then again after that. A safety protocol Deon rewrote after a near-miss incident on Dock 4. Bryce presented it as his own to the VP on a Tuesday morning call. A vendor relationship Deon had rebuilt from scratch with a carrier out of Nashville. Bryce CC'd himself onto the email chain 2 days before the announcement and stood beside the account manager in the photo for the company newsletter. By December, Deon had stopped submitting proposals under his own name. He started routing things through a supervisor named Linda Okafor, who'd been at the company 8 years and had Bryce's ear. Linda knew what was happening. She didn't like it. But she also had a mortgage and a daughter starting college in the fall, and some things you calculate before you pick a fight. "You're better than this place," she told him once, after hours, standing in the parking lot with her keys in her hand. "I know," he said. "That's not a compliment, Deon. I'm telling you to be careful." He thought he understood what she meant. He didn't, not yet. It escalated in January. The Memphis Center had been selected as a pilot location for a new warehouse management system, a significant rollout, the kind that either impresses corporate or becomes a cautionary tale with no middle ground. Bryce had been assigned to lead it. He had approximately zero technical fluency, and he knew it, which made him anxious. And anxious men in positions of power tend to look for someone to carry the weight while they carry the title. He looked at Deon, not because he respected him, because Deon was the only person in that building who'd actually read the vendor documentation. Bryce called him into the office on a Wednesday and told him he was tapping him for a key role on the implementation team. No official title change, no additional compensation discussed. Just proximity to a high-visibility project, and the implication that things would shake out well if Deon performed. Deon asked carefully what shake out well meant. Bryce smiled the smile of a man who had never once been asked to define his vague promises. It means we take care of our own, Deon. You know how it works. Deon did not, in fact, know how it worked. But he took the assignment because the project was real and the problem was interesting, and because somewhere beneath the fatigue of the past 4 months, he still genuinely liked the work. He spent the next 6 weeks essentially running the implementation, coordinating with the software vendor, training shift leads, rewriting the integration documentation, because the vendor's version was unusable, running parallel tests on weekends, sometimes alongside his direct supervisor, a younger guy named Keith Farrow, who was sharp and eager and completely transparent about the fact that Deon was the one keeping the thing from falling apart. "Man, you should be leading this officially," Keith said one night, around 9:30, both of them surrounded by printouts and cold coffee. "I am leading it," Deon said. Keith looked at him for a moment. "You know what I mean." Deon knew exactly what he meant. The system went live in the 3rd week of February. Clean launch. 0 critical errors in the first 72 hours, which in a rollout of this scale was essentially unheard of. Corporate sent an email. The VP of Operations, a woman named Patricia Hong out of the Chicago office, called Bryce directly to congratulate him. Bryce accepted the congratulations. He did not mention Deon's name once. That afternoon, Deon was in the middle of the floor doing a post-launch walkthrough when his phone buzzed. A calendar invite from Bryce's assistant. Check-in meeting, Thursday, 2 p.m., conference room B. He figured it was a debrief, post-launch review, normal stuff. He should have paid more attention to who else was on the invite. Thursday came. Deon walked into conference room B at 1:58 and found Bryce already seated, along with HR manager Sandra Pruitt, a woman Deon had spoken to exactly once during his onboarding, and a man he didn't recognize, with a yellow legal pad and the particular stillness of someone who has done this many times before. There was no debrief agenda on the table. There was a printed incident report. "We've received some concerns," Bryce said, and there was something in his voice, a flatness, a rehearsed quality, that told Deon this had been prepared. "From multiple members of the team, about your conduct during the implementation." Deon sat very still. What conduct, specifically? Intimidating behavior toward junior staff, bypassing chain of command. There's also a mention of an altercation in the break room in mid-January. The break room in mid-January. Deon knew exactly what that referred to. A disagreement, professional, no raised voices, with a vendor technician who had tried to skip a critical validation step. Keith Farrow had been standing 10 feet away. 2 dock supervisors had witnessed the whole thing. The technician had thanked Deon afterward for catching the error. "That's not what happened," Deon said. "We have statements," Sandra said. "Whose statements?" She looked at her folder. She did not answer. What unfolded over the next 30 minutes was a masterpiece of institutional misdirection. Vague language. Statements with no dates, no names. The incident report referencing a pattern of behavior without specifying a single concrete incident. The kind of document designed not to be refuted because it contained nothing specific enough to refute. The kind of document Deon recognized with a cold clarity as something assembled after the fact. He had been too successful. He had made Bryce look insufficient by comparison, and Bryce had decided, probably weeks ago, probably before the system even went live, that the cleanest solution was removal. "You're placing me on a performance improvement plan," Deon said. It wasn't a question. Bryce nodded. "It's a standard process, based on an incident report with no named witnesses, no dates, and no specifics, filed 3 days after a successful system launch that I ran from front to back." He kept his voice level. He had been in difficult rooms before. He knew that composure was the only armor that mattered right now. "I want to be clear that I'm noting, for the record, that this meeting was scheduled without my knowledge of its purpose, and that I was not given the opportunity to bring a representative." Sandra wrote something down. "That's your right," she said, and her voice had a slight hesitation in it that Deon noticed. He stood. "I'll be in touch." He drove home. He called his sister in Atlanta. She listened, and then she said, "Deon, You know what you need to do. He did. He had known for 3 weeks, really, in the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color. He had been documenting everything, not dramatically, not with some predetermined plan, just the habit of a careful man in an environment that had never quite felt right. Emails saved to a personal folder, dates and summaries in a plain notebook he kept in his car, screenshots of project files with his name as the last editor, the vendor documentation he'd rewritten, version tracked, timestamped, and, as of 6 weeks ago, something else. The distribution center had a security camera system, updated during Q4, high resolution, covering the floor, the dock areas, and crucially the second-floor hallway outside the executive offices. The cameras were managed by the building's facilities contractor, not by Hargrove HR. Deon had worked with the facilities team during the implementation. He knew one of the technicians, man named Otis, 22 years on the job, old school and methodical, and he knew that Otis kept archive footage on a 30-day rolling cycle. He had not asked Otis for anything yet, but he had noted the timeline. The meeting in Conference Room B had been recorded by the building's own system. The hallway outside it was on camera. The conversation Bryce had with Sandra Pruitt in the parking lot, 2 days before the meeting, the one Deon had seen from his car, neither of them aware he was there, Bryce doing most of the talk, Sandra nodding with the particular nod of someone being instructed rather than consulted. That conversation had happened directly under camera 7. 30-day rolling cycle. He had 11 days before that footage was overwritten. That night, Deon made 2 phone calls. The first was to an employment attorney named Howard Gaines, whose name he'd gotten from a friend, who listened for 20 minutes and then said, "Don't quit, don't sign anything, and get me that footage before day 30. The second call was to Otis. Otis didn't ask a lot of questions. He'd worked in enough corporate buildings long enough to understand when someone was being set up. "Come by Saturday morning," he said. "Bring a drive." Deon came by Saturday morning. What was on that drive was not a smoking gun in the dramatic sense. It was more precise than that. It was Bryce Calloway, 3 days before a formal HR meeting, standing in a parking lot, telling Sandra Pruitt that the performance improvement plan needed to be airtight, because once you put these guys on a PEEP, the clock runs out and they can't claim anything. It was Sandra saying, hesitantly, "Do we have enough documentation?" It was Bryce saying, "We'll have enough. I'll get Keith to sign something." Keith Farrow, who had spent 6 weeks watching Deon run a flawless implementation. Keith Farrow, who had said, "You should be leading this officially," and who, apparently, had been asked to provide a statement afterward. Howard Gaines filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission 10 days later. The complaint was specific, documented, and devastating. It referenced the footage. It referenced the project timeline. It referenced a pattern of credit theft that Howard had pulled together from Deon's notebook entries and the saved email chain, demonstrating, cleanly, without ambiguity, that 3 separate initiatives, presented by Bryce Calloway, to corporate leadership bore Deon's fingerprints in every version-tracked document and had been systematically reattributed after the fact. Hargrove's corporate HR, based in Cincinnati, received the filing on a Tuesday. By Thursday, someone from the legal department had called the Memphis office. Bryce was on a call with Cincinnati on Friday morning that lasted 2 hours. By the following Monday, Deon received cheesemail from a vice president he'd never spoken to, requesting a direct conversation. He did not make it easy for them. Howard had advised patience, and Howard was right. The first conversation was exploratory, corporate trying to understand the scope of what they were looking at. The second conversation had a general counsel's on the line. The third conversation had an offer. Deon listened to the offer. He thanked them for their time. He told them he'd have Howard respond by end of week. What came back was not just a settlement number, though the number was significant. It was a formal written acknowledgement, something corporate resisted, and then accepted when Howard quietly mentioned the footage would be relevant in discovery, that Deon Wakefield's work on the WMS implementation had been foundational to its success, and had not been properly credited. It was Bryce Calloway's resignation, framed publicly as a transition, but absent any of the usual farewell emails, any of the usual handshakes. Just a name removed from the org chart on a Wednesday afternoon. And it was something Deon had asked for specifically. Something Howard had raised an eyebrow at, but included in the language anyway. A formal recommendation letter from the VP of Operations, Patricia Hong, to be used at Deon's discretion. Not because he needed it for the legal case. Because he wanted it on record that a person in this company, in writing, with their name attached, had acknowledged what he was. He got it. Linda Okafor found out on a Thursday. She was in the parking lot again. Same spot, same set of keys. When Deon walked out, she looked at him for a long moment. "I heard," she said. "Yeah, how?" "I documented everything." He said it simply, without drama, the way you describe something obvious in hindsight. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have done more." "You told me to be careful," he said. "That was something." She nodded. He could see she was working through the arithmetic of it. What she'd said, what she hadn't, what she could have. Some of that math doesn't resolve cleanly, and Deon understood that too. He didn't fill the silence with absolution. Some things you have to sit with on your own. He left Hargrove 3 weeks later, not because he had to, but because Patricia Hong had offered him something else entirely. A regional operations role at the Chicago facility, 2 levels above where he'd been in Memphis, with a compensation package that reflected, actually reflected, what his file had been showing for years. He took the F-150 to a detailing shop before the drive up to Chicago. Figured if he was going to pull into a new parking lot, he might as well do it clean. On his last day in Memphis, Keith Farrow stopped him near the loading dock. Keith looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who has thought carefully about what to say and still isn't sure. "I didn't sign anything," Keith said. "When Bryce asked me, I want you to know that." Deon looked at him. "I know," he said. "It's in the record." Keith exhaled. "I should have said something sooner." "Yeah," Deon said, not unkindly, just honestly. He drove north on I-55 with the windows down despite the cold, Patricia Hong's letter in the glove box, his notebook in the back seat with everything written down in it. Every date, every meeting, every moment he'd been invisible in a room he'd held up. He'd spent months wondering if the work would speak for itself. He knew now that the work doesn't speak for itself. The work needs a witness. Sometimes you have to be that witness. You have to write it down. You have to keep the drive. You have to know which camera is pointed at which hallway and how many days before the footage rolls over. And sometimes, when the building finally falls quiet, the record is the only thing left standing. What would you have done if you had been in that break room in January, watching Deon get talked over for the 4th time in 4 months? Would you have said something? Or would you have looked at your mortgage, your daughter's tuition, your own parking space, and decided today wasn't the day?